Welcome everyone to TIPS Forum 2024. My name is Saul Levin and I'm going to be moderating this opening session. To everyone who's in the online, we have quite a few people online and we'll try and make sure that everyone online gets the full experience. It's going to be quite an eventful day and a half. We've got multiple presenters. I think there's over 40 papers. We also have a really dynamic closing panel at lunchtime tomorrow on the second day. So we hope many of you will stay for that closing panel and also enjoy the multiple sessions that we've got. There's some really interesting and exciting papers, so I'm also looking forward to joining in. Just to acknowledge the speakers who are on the opening panel. We've got Professor Fiona Tregenna, who is the Research Chair of the South African Research Chair in Industrial Development at the University of Johannesburg. We have the Acting Director General from the dtic, Malebo Mabitje-Thompson. We have from TIPS, Dr. Neva Makgetla, who will also be presenting. Both Malebo and Neva will be presenting online. And then we've got Vignesh Subramani from Absa, who will be joining us on the stage shortly. If he's in the room. Oh, you're here, great. Okay, so welcome everyone and welcome to our speakers. We also have some politicians in the room and online. They are as participants, so we acknowledge them and that they're joining the session. Also to benefit from the interesting and rich discussion that we're looking forward to over the next 2 days. Just a few opening remarks from my side is that what we have seen is the growth in small businesses over the last couple of years. But every time that we see this growth and there's been a shock. We were seeing growth up till the start of the global financial crisis. The shock hits the number of small businesses, we see a decline. We then start growing again and we see the sector starting to thrive, and then we have COVID-19, another shock, and the numbers fall again, and then we slowly start to rebuild. Small business has been a policy priority from 94 as an area to support economic development, inclusive growth, and for me, it's a core part of industrial policy, and it's something that we need to think about. How do we ramp up that support? How do we say it can't be business as usual when it comes to the small business sector? We need a more dynamic environment. We need a better supportive ecosystem that's going to see a step change in the level of support and the growth in the number of small businesses. We also see that the growth in the sector would contribute to inclusive industrial development and will contribute to a more equitable society. So these are priority areas for TIPS and has been an area that we thought we should focus on in terms of the forum for this year. So it informed our decision to do this topic, but very closely align it to how we're thinking about industrial policy, seeing small business as part of industrial policy. So with those very few words, I'm going to not say more because there's more interesting speakers than me that are going to be presenting and thinking about these issues over the next day and a half. If I don't get a chance at the end of the conference, I'm going to say the thank yous now so that we get that done. So just to the organizing team at TIPS, Lesego in particular, who's outside making sure everything works with the registration and who's put together this very comprehensive program for us. Also the people who are chairing sessions, our presenters and our speakers. Thank you very much to everyone. And also to acknowledge the support from the South African Research Chair, which contributed to the program, and to Absa, which have also contributed to supporting this hopefully very exciting 2-day forum. Okay, just a few housekeeping things which I'll talk to at the end. So let's start with the speakers. Hi. Okay, so our first speaker on the panel for this opening session is Professor Fiona Tregenna, who is from the South African Research Chair in Industrial Development at UJ. The full profiles of all of our speakers, there's a QR code that you can scan and get onto the website, which will give you all the relevant information. We were trying to chop down less trees, so we didn't print a lot of programs. But if you desperately need a program, you can find one. But let me hand over to Fiona. Thank you.
Thanks, Saul, Dr. Levin. Yeah, just going to say really a few words of welcome before handing over to the keynote speaker. It's really fantastic to be here again for the TIPS Annual Forum. It's a fixture on people's calendars. We know it's always around this time of year, end of July, beginning of August, and every year with a different theme related with industrial policy, industrial development, trade, and so on. I think the theme of this year's annual forum is really apposite and looking specifically at the role of small business and what is needed to support small business in relation to industrial policy. I think too often the discussions around small business tend to look at things of labor regulations, so zoning and so on. And sometimes there's that missing link in terms of the structure of the economy, industrial policy, what are the kinds of barriers to entry facing small business in terms of breaking into production, into supply chains, into customer markets, and so on. And thinking of it holistically as part of an industrialization agenda for the country. And I think it's also crucial, there's the word inclusive somewhere there. Inclusivity obviously has many dimensions. We can think of it in terms of race, gender, spatial patterns, and so on. And a really crucial one is in terms of the size of business as well. And looking at how to open up the structure of the economy so that small businesses and micro businesses have those pathways to entry and to growth and to making contributions, not only just to small scale jobs, but ultimately also to innovation, to exports, and hopefully to growing into large businesses as well. So yeah, it's a fantastic program. I mean, looking at the papers that are being presented, I think really connecting with some of the key themes. I see papers on the financing of small business and industrial parks, gender and small business, industrial policy and small business, and so on. So I think it's really tapping into some of those key themes. And I've always found one of the fantastic parts of the TIPS Forum being at this interface of research, policy, practitioners, and bringing together the research community from academia as well as from outside academia with government policymakers, the corporate sector, the NPO sector, and so on. And it's really great, even in the sessions, to hear that kind of cross-fertilization of ideas. And I would really urge people to bring their own experiences, challenges to the table. If you disagree with something which a presenter is arguing from your own experiences, from your own sector, those are the kinds of constructive engagements that we would like to see there. As the South African Research Chair, we're really honored and delighted to be again partnering and in this forum. I think for us, it's a really key way of bringing some of these themes to prominence and working with other partners in the sector. Just very briefly, ours is a research center based at the University of Johannesburg. Thematically, we're focusing on industrial development as well as with kind of related topics, innovation and technological upgrading, trade, regional integration, green industrialization, green industrial policy, and so on. Of particular interest linked to the theme of this year's conference, we run a survey every 3 years on micro and small enterprises in the city of Johannesburg, collecting primary data on what are the challenges, what are they doing, particularly in terms of innovation, what is the performance and so on. And we're looking at different aspects there: gender, age, finance constraints, and so on. And yeah, hope to link up with some people there in relation to that project. Our work broadly is around 3 planks: research, public and policy engagement, and training and capacity building. I'm happy to engage further with anyone interested in being maybe a visiting researcher, postdoc, collaborating in research projects, and so on. So let me leave it there and hand back to Saul, and look forward to the keynote speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona. Okay, let's move to our first keynote speaker, which is Malebo Mabitje-Thompson, who's the Acting Director General of the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition. She will be joining us online from Cape Town. The floor is yours. We can see you, we can hear you. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. I'm going to keep the camera on for a short while, and if bandwidth for one reason or the other doesn't play along, I might just have to turn off the camera. But I think to the conference organizers, thank you very much for having invited me to be part of this conference. I apologize for a bit of a voice issue there, just recovering from a flu. The chair of TIPS, Saul Levin, thank you very much for the invite. Let me also recognize my fellow panelists, the research community, comprised of government officials. I heard Saul talking about politicians. In my world, it's not politicians, it's ministers and deputy ministers, members of parliament, both present and post, senior government officials, academics, representatives from industry. And I also note that Absa is also a sponsor. So Saul has already welcomed you. I hope what I will deliver to you today will also provide some value to the work that you do. And as I've said, I'm very, very glad to be with you this morning. My name is Malebo Mabitje-Thompson. I am the Acting Director General of the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition. And I've been asked to talk about part of this big theme of this conference, very apt theme of the conference on small business, inclusive growth, industrial policy in South Africa. And it's almost like an all-encompassing important topic, but a topic that I think helps us to go back and think through, when we talk about industrial policy, what are we talking about? For who are we talking about? And to what outcomes are we looking at? And I think Fiona started touching on some of those issues, including the transformation aspects of industrial policy, transforming of supply chains, transforming of localities, transforming of economic activity, transforming of our own export markets. So various aspects in transformation that are encompassed by this big ambition to industrialize our country. So I'm going to try and share my discussion into a couple of points. First of all, because in this part of the session at least, we're looking at the South African context. Just to share with you the policy context that informs our own industrialization pathway, and I'll call it that. And I'll start a little bit talking about the GNU, and then go into some of the emerging priorities, and then quickly then circle back to the issue of how this affects small business, and how it also affects how we should be responding to small business. So most of you would know that we as a country went into an election, and we voted into power different parties. They opted to form a government of national unity. And that government of national unity agreed on key principles that will inform how it would work. And I want to just read to you a statement, parts of the statement of intent from the GNU that is relevant to the discussion we're having today. It reads as follows. It says, rapid, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth, the promotion of fixed capital investment and industrialization, job creation, transformation, livelihood support, land reform, infrastructure development, structural reform, and transformational change, fiscal sustainability, and sustainable use of our natural resources and endowments. And then it has a statement that also talks to macroeconomic management that must support national development goals in a sustainable manner. So the GNU statement of intent talks to the need for us to rapidly grow in a manner that is inclusive, sustainable, and also promotes investment. It goes further to say that we must create a more just society by tackling poverty, spatial inequalities, food security, and the high cost of living, providing a social safety net, improving access to and the quality of basic services, and protecting worker rights. So you can see that it's a whole series of priorities that themselves require a coherent policy in order for these priorities to be realized. And most of these can actually be realized if you have a well-targeted industrial policy. And hence I said that the sessions and how they've been structured, the theme of this year's engagement is apt, given where we are in the planning process of the GNU. And what I would argue it does is that it puts industrial policy as an important pillar of government's economic policy in this administration. And because industrial policy is not a policy of 5 years, 2 years, 3 years, but a policy that requires a long runway, it also lays a basis for various other administrations to be able to work with a policy that can take the industrial landscape forward in South Africa. Most people will argue that we've been saying for a while now, talking about industrial policy in South Africa. There are other quarters where they're asking whether we actually do have an industrial policy in South Africa. And one of the matrices that they would look at is manufacturing. And most of you would know that over time, manufacturing has been declining. In terms of real output, it has been declining. In terms of its contribution to GDP, it's been declining. But manufacturing has also been playing an important role in other important matrices, and one of it, interestingly, is on employment, both formal and informal, and on importation of goods and services, and also exports of goods and services, which are all quite important, especially if that importation is not just consumption, but also investment that allows you to be a more productive society. So the question of whether we have industrial policy or not, I leave that to you. But the question of whether we need industrial policy, I would say that the GNU has definitely said, yes, we do. And indeed, I think most of our political principles, including in their own recent statements now, have indicated a need to have a policy that guides how South Africa's growth is going to unfold. Then I said that, industrial policy means a lot to many people. And my definition of industrial policy, as I talk to you today, I'm looking particularly at policies that are designed to help domestic sectors reach goals that markets alone are unlikely to achieve. So an impactful intervention by the state that allows markets to be catalyzed for better growth than otherwise would be the case without the state. We've heard many commentators also talking about the fact that industrial policy is back, and therefore many developing countries are at a good place now to roll out their own industrial policies. My own argument has been, I don't know where it left to, because at least in the US, at least in a number of countries, industrial policy has always been there. It is just how we have chosen to speak about it, highlight it, that may change from time to time. And I'm sure most of you would agree with me that countries such as the US, for example, I mean, they've got a beautiful name for industrial policy. It's called the Inflation Reduction Act. Very beautiful in the sense that it's industrial policy of a special kind. And you can berate what they are doing, because it does have effect on most of the rest of the world. Or we can also do as they do, not as they say, and implement an industrial policy that helps us solve for our own problems. And I think in this administration, one of the ambitions that has been made very clear is that we will have an industrial policy that seeks to solve for South Africa's problem. For a problem. And the problems we're solving for, the biggest of all, is unemployment, inequality, and the persistent poverty that has been a part of an important definer of the country. So if I go back and track a little bit on maybe even not talking about some of the challenges, because sometimes we talk too much about the challenges, but reflect a bit on some of the opportunities that are arising from this time that we are in, of relooking at our industrial policy. One key opportunity that has now arisen coming out of procurement legislation that the president assented a couple of weeks ago. It's on the procurement side of industrial policy. Yeah. Most of you would know, if I maybe just go there a little bit, to say you can have various types of industrial policy. Horizontal industrial policy that just looks at improving business environment across all sectors of the economy. You can have a vertical industrial policy that then zooms into particular sectors. You can have an industrial policy that deals with supply side or demand side considerations. And now we've got this a big instrument on procurement. And what that instrument does is that it allows us to be able to indicate, not through what we think can happen, but a research-based decisions that can guide us into areas where we need to industrialize. And using government as the base or the first port of call for procurement or creation of demand in those sectors. So it's an important instrument that was available, but now it's much it's been improved for the whole of government to do that, and that also has an important implication for small businesses. What are those products that for us are priority, that are produced in South Africa? And of those businesses or products or services, what are those that we know are good at? And therefore, those opportunities must be opened for small business, in order for small businesses to be able to take up those opportunities. What will be the kind of interventions that will need to be put in place in order for them to be able to materialize that opportunity? And those are the not only critical questions, but the areas that where not just government, but all stakeholders will have to think through and do so quite quickly, because the window of opportunity of reviewing some of these things, putting them from talk to actual action, ordinarily is not a window that stays there permanently. We do need to take advantage of these things in as quickly as they come up. And one of the things that government has to do, and do so intentionally, is improve its ability to plan with stakeholders. And most of you will know about the master plans that we have introduced. The big thing about those master plans is actually the process that it allows for government to co-create, co-design industrial strategies with sector champions and businesses that are able on their own or collectively to grow each of the sectors and take their sectors to the next level. The question that the discussion today wants to zoom in on is, how does all of these things affect small business? And I think all of us will agree that in business, size does matter. And it matters both ways. When you're small, you're agile. When you're small, you're more adaptable. You're quick to respond. But when you're small, you also have other disadvantages. And one of the key disadvantages of small businesses in South Africa is their access to the negotiation table. When some of these master plans, when some of these industrial and sector development priorities are set. And that is in part the reason why, despite a lot of effort that has gone into most of the interventions that have been put in place, be it in the auto sector, be it in innovation, be it in various sectors where government for a long time has put money in and has gotten some returns. Those returns on their own have not been able to unlock massive participation of small businesses in a way that we know that small businesses are able to really take up that place in the economy of creating a lot of jobs, of spurring a lot of innovation, and of actually creating what I would call a competitive country in ways that big enterprises are not able to. And I think one of the issues we need to solve for is how do we, in reality, bring small businesses on the table, and who do we bring on the table? Small businesses are not a homogeneous set or a group of businesses. They are very different, and sectors are also very different. The one area that I think industrial policy in South Africa should focus on, if it is to also look at small business in a more inclusive manner, is to look at particularly how we bring in rural and peri-urban businesses around the table. Most of you will know the example of KWV. It's I'll call it, initially was a cooperative in the wine industry, and all they did was become a market aggregator. And what has happened, because we've got so many disparate production centers happening in rural areas, all of these have been, in a way, left to remain small and die small, because we have not had a focused priority on market aggregation. We used to have marketing boards. Some of them are no longer there. And I'm not saying every sector, that type of aggregation will be important. But at least we know in manufacturing, at least we know that in agriculture, that type of aggregation becomes very important, where a farmer doesn't have to know everything about what is happening in their own product line in the market. They don't have to know about all these new developments. They don't have to know about every single part of how to protect their crop. That information can be made available to them through an aggregator process. And I think at some point we're talking about these as cooperatives, because that's really truly what they are to do, how we embed this to our systems going forward for development in particular. How do you create those cold chain value chains? How do you create value chains that help in research and development, so that people, particularly in rural provinces and far outlying areas, don't find that the only way that they can be truly productive is for them to come closer to industrial centers. And the reason I am picking on this one in particular, I am hoping that tips through this forum would help us think through what type and level of aggregation do we need to do for small business in order to assist small business to be this big part of inclusive growth and drive in a real industrial policy going forward. And I apologize that I brought my problem to you, but it's a problem that I hope you will help me solve for. My very last one, and I know I'm running out of time, is on the issue of rural systems. And that is very important, that we find a way that our industrial policy is not so alien to rural systems, that people in rural areas don't understand what it is that we are talking about when we come with these concepts. I looked with interest at all the papers. I didn't see any concept of a stock fail. on on these papers. It's something that is very my heart, because rural communities, peri-urban communities have found ways to finance themselves, and they are financing themselves outside of the formal financial system. And if we are unable to work with them where they are, we will inevitably leave them behind. It is important, particularly amongst our academics, that as we're talking about access to finance, making finance cheap, making the processes accessible to as many people as possible, so that we can still that we also look at what are the indigenous systems of financing enterprises, and how can we allow those systems to come into play a lot more, so that they are part of our industrial policy. So we don't just say to IDC, make financing cheap, without saying, how do you respond to the industrial policy ambitions of rural communities, some of which are held in how they finance themselves. How do we challenge our financing community? Absa is a sponsor here, that they move from just storing stokvels funds, but have proper investment vehicles for stokvels within our funding system, as part of us transforming the landscape. Those are the big and important questions that we do need to answer for, if industrial policy is to have an inclusive character to it. And I'm talking in this way, with years of having been part of development of industrial policy, and increasingly seeing industrial policy doing what it does, but not having the expansionary net effect that it needs to have. There are businesses in rural areas, in peri-urban areas, in townships, that are going to be able to benefit from any form of industrial policy, as long as we find mechanisms to bring people around the table and be able to solve for problems that keep them small, that make their growth anemic, so that these enterprises can also be an important part of our growth trajectory. So I hope I did not take too much of your time. I did not talk about exports. I did not talk about the AfCFTA. I did not talk about the IPA. I did not talk about incentives. I didn't talk about any of those, because all of your people now know all of these, and there are much more well-informed panelists that are going to discuss that. I am raising a matter that, when I went through the agenda, I thought perhaps hasn't been well dealt with, and I know I've taken also the role of being a moderator of a session that doesn't exist, in order to just introduce these other parts. Because when we talk about an unconventional industrial policy, it must be also unconventional in practice. So I thank you, and I wish everyone a very good session, and I'll continue to be online. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much, Malebo, and thank you for the very useful insights and helping to get us thinking about some of the key issues that are confronting our industrial policy and the alignment with small business development. Let me then, it's the perfect point at which to hand over to Dr. Neva Makgetla, who's going to talk about small business and industrial policy. If we can pull her up onto the screen. There we go, Neva, we can see you. Great. Okay. And we can.
I'm going to share my slides. Okay.
Perfect. Okay. Over to you. Thanks very much.
Okay. So I was asked to speak about small business and industrialization. I think the acting DG's input really sets the frame. But I think it's important to look at where we are in South Africa with regards to small business, because the thing that's actually quite astonishing when you look at the data is that we have so little employment in employers and self-employed people as a share of total employment, and that in many ways that explains the very high levels of joblessness and the low employment ratio in South Africa. So in South Africa, since before 94, around 40% of the population, of the adult population, says they're employed. That compares to, around 60% in other upper middle income countries. And we're low on waged employment, but we are particularly low on self-employment and employed people and employers compared to other upper middle income countries. What you can see here is that, as the DG said, in historic labor setting regions, waged employment is also low. But outside of those areas, waged employment is almost at the level found in other upper middle income countries. It's self-employment that is particularly low, at about 5% of the total. If we were going to have the same level of self-employment and employment by extension as other upper middle income countries, we need about 2 million more enterprises, which is almost twice as many as we now have. And just to flag, I think in effect, we're saying there are 3 options to dealing with the employment challenge by extension. We can vastly increase the number of family businesses, that is small, very small businesses. We can increase waged employment, which would require, particularly expansion in labor-intensive industries. Or we could do what the easier thing, which is to provide social grants, or possibly collective ownership, which is actually hard, to redistribute earned income in the economy rather than trying to change the way production generates earned incomes to make it more equitable. Obviously, some combination of these is possible, but I do think we need to say, how are we going to combine those things if we want to overcome the employment crisis, which is so central to the challenges South Africa is facing. And I think to do that, we have to understand, why is self-employment in South Africa so very low? And I think we all know it's because of the destruction of Black-owned businesses. Interestingly, we lag behind in both rural and urban self-employment compared to other upper middle income countries. So it's not just agriculture, where peasant agriculture was effectively destroyed, but it's also in the urban areas where small businesses like retail, small manufacturing, services of all kinds were also swept away. But it also is, that destruction was reinforced by apartheid income differentials, because what that meant is, on the one hand, formal small businesses typically have higher incomes for the entrepreneurs, for the owners, but fewer employees in order to get to that higher income compared to, for instance, in Latin America. And there's been research on that. But also there's a problem that we think, township economies are one of our core ways of thinking about small business. But in fact, in working class communities, demand is very low because incomes are low and joblessness is high. You get a bit of a vicious cycle there. The average household income in townships is about a tenth, between a quarter and a tenth of what you find in the higher income suburbs. And obviously that limits the scope for small businesses to be paid by households to serve the community. And the situation was aggravated also by the fact that before 1994, government support for the economy tended to center on the mining value chain and commercial farming, which from around 1980, early 1980s, pretty much stopped creating jobs and actually started shedding jobs at quite a fast rate. Part of the question, though, is if apartheid was the root cause of the destruction of small business, why has small business not simply bounced back once we got rid of overtly racial laws? The critical issues are that access to productive and financial assets, education, infrastructure, but also experience in supply chain relationships that in other countries people get through their family experience. Those things remain incredibly unequal. So it's still really, if you are in a working class household, the chances that you're going to get a better education, the chances that you will inherit assets, the chances that you will even have adequate water and electricity and transport for to your home and your community remains much worse than if you're in a richer household, in a richer community. Meanwhile, the systems of government in the private sector were set up to serve established private business and state-owned companies, and they actually don't do well in supporting small business. So you still see that small businesses have, or potential small businesses have, limited access to industrial and commercial sites, to markets, to finance, and to licenses. And industrial policy has tended to focus primarily on enabling established formal business to move up the value chain and to expand exports. It hasn't, if you look at the amount we've done of effort we have put in and the resources we put in to support small business, it's still not the dominant thing in our industrial policy, and we don't really have a sense of where the balance should be. So really what we're saying is, when you destroy small business on such a large scale, you also destroy the ecosystems that support them. You need a much more holistic approach to ensure that they have all of these different prerequisites they need in order to be able to operate. So it's not just simply, are people entrepreneurial, or do they have finance? It's a whole range of other relationships, knowledge, and infrastructure that is needed for small businesses to thrive. Those things were swept away under apartheid. How do we think about rebuilding them if we want to see small business as an important way to generate employment the way it is in other upper middle income countries? And then I have a graph which you can see on the slides about how we can think in more detail about those conditions. But I do think what it means is the challenge for industrial policy is that, you know, our understanding of industrial policy in South Africa has tended to be that we have to promote industrialization through competitive, high-tech, and mostly capital-intensive industries. The question is, how do we move up the value chain? How do we have increased technological capacity so that and an ability to compete and to export internationally? The trouble is, by definition, if you're raising productivity, you're only going to generate substantial growth in employment if you are vastly able to expand exports. And even then, if your biggest exports, as in South Africa, are mining and auto, those things can grow very fast. They're not going to generate employment on a significant scale. The countries that have generated employment through industrialization have done it primarily through clothing and textiles, electronics assembly, and other light industries, which in South Africa remain very far behind when it comes to exports and even to domestic production. And you know, high-tech, capital-intensive industries often have very limited scope for small business. So small businesses can be very high-tech, but capital-intensive industries, by definition, you have big barriers to entry to small companies because you need big investments to start out. So the question becomes, how can we support producers that generate incomes that are sustainable, but are not the kind of companies we've historically supported? They're very decentralized. They often serve communities where demand is limited because households are simply not earning much, and they often have no prospect of becoming internationally competitive. Even though they meet local needs, they build up social and human capital, and again, they increased earned income, particularly for lower income households, but they're unlikely ever to get into exports, and they may not even grow very much. And the flip side of that is, how do we think about support for established big businesses if that becomes critical for sustaining the economy, but maybe not the core of industrial policy the way it is now? So, I mean, in effect, we're saying we need extensive growth, which is where you grow using more resources, as opposed to focusing only on growth through efficiency, which is sometimes called intensive growth. It really means we need to shift support to labor-intensive activities and think also about what are the institutional systems required to make them actually function in the long run. So what that means is, for instance, in terms of labor-intensive activities, how do we support services of all kinds, for instance, tourism and hospitality, the cultural industries, which includes things like live events, design, hairdressing, crafts, and so on? How do we support engineering and other high-level professional services? And how do we support the public services and public employment schemes in ways that maximize employment? There's also small-scale forestry and agriculture and how they are integrated into value chains and supply chains. There's some work on that, but it remains relatively small scale. And then there's also issues around construction, including public work schemes and solar installation. Part of the problem is government is not really set up to support small business in a decentralized way and to set up schemes that can provide, again, holistic support where necessary. And so what you need is to say, what are the intermediaries that can take that on? For instance, grants for programs to support small business and social enterprise, but on a much larger scale than we have to date. There are things like contracting schemes like we've seen in agriculture, forestry, and fashion and crafts. There's franchise operations for services such as fast food, but also tutoring, cleaning, gardening, and so on. There's supporting township enterprises through new commercial retail and sometimes light industrial sites that, enterprises that serve the community. There's thinking about how we can provide public services in a more labor-intensive fashion. And remember, public services are critical employers, especially for Black women. We have things like community health workers and teacher aides that are already providing employment on a very large scale. The question is, how do we expand those substantially if we're serious about job creation? How do we come up with proactive support for social enterprises that meet community needs? For instance, installing solar energy, providing early childhood development, but where households actually can't afford to pay for these needs, even though in the long run, there's a high return to society in terms of economic growth, but also human and social capital. And there's also thinking about how you could formalize temporary workers' employment through gig employment schemes and so on that could provide benefits, as well as helping people find work. So those are just examples of the kinds of innovative thinking we need if we're serious about supporting small business. It requires innovative forms of investment, payment, and decision-making. We don't have systems in the state that make it easy to support, for instance, social enterprises that are intermediaries that in turn support small business. And the real thing is, how do you enable not just entrepreneurship, but also collective action in historically disempowered communities? These things require really big changes in industrial policy. If we make employment and equality our top priorities, it's a big paradigm shift. And I think none of us really has thought through what would that look like. It would mean, for instance, we'd have to think through, how do we support labor-intensive sectors and industries? That would mean restructuring the sector desks and the incentive schemes to reflect those new priorities. We'd have to think about what are the procedures that make it difficult for the DTIC to support intermediaries able to reach small businesses, especially in small communities. What would that look like also in terms of things like payment schemes, but also capacity within the DTIC? What kinds of skills do we need to support those kinds of intermediaries to identify which ones can actually work? Big problem is risk management and payment regulations. Treasury has typically had a view on structural change, which is it's disruptive, it's risky, we can't really pay for it. But of course, then we never get to the structural change because we never put in the resources on a large scale. And finally, how do we ensure support from other agencies, for instance, infrastructure and education? How do we set up more structured engagement and platforms to ensure coordination? But I would argue we also need to have a short list of programs that are very large scale, that are clear priorities, so that ESCOM and Transnet and municipalities know they need to align their work around those priorities, as opposed to having a long shopping list and they pick which ones they want to support. The flip side of this is a different approach to established industries if they're no longer the only priority for industrial policy. And I would argue a critical issue is that we need to prioritize competitiveness and growth, not just rescue operations, that we've tended to respond to industries that are in crisis. We haven't actually said which ones can grow. And that means, firstly, of course, getting basic infrastructure right, but also saying, how do we reduce rents to commodity producers, for instance, soya for poultry feed, iron ore, coal, and scrap for steel, textiles for clothing, in order to ensure that our final producers are more competitive. That is our comparative advantage. How do we maximize that? How do we think about technological upgrades where they will actually improve competitiveness rather than just displacing jobs? And how do we think about more efficient licensing that is a regulatory framework that is easier for big companies, but doesn't sacrifice the standards and the change we're trying to achieve? And the one thing I would really propose is we have to be much more careful about introducing measures to reduce competition, whether it's from domestic or foreign companies. We should only permit those things where we'll, in the long term, promote competitiveness rather than simply protecting existing interests, which is always a temptation for industrial policy. So in short, we need a paradigm shift to promote extensive growth, which has never been a critical part of our industrial policy. And that means effectively we need to vastly scale up support for labor-intensive industries and self-employment and rethink what we mean by competitiveness in the long run, both for small business, but also for established business. And it's hard to walk on two legs sometimes. So we have to massively scale up programs to establish supportive ecosystems for small business, which requires big systemic and resourcing changes. At the same time, we have to help established producers become more competitive rather than focusing only on protecting them from foreign and domestic competition, where it will not lead to competitiveness in the long run. And it entails big changes in the way the state has functioned around industrial policy. Firstly, we have to rethink what we mean by sustainability, which takes into account externalities, including in the sense of human and social investments, investment in human and social capital, which often takes place through small business and services and community development. And what are the long-term needs of society and the economy? And how do we support that? And then we need to be very clear that we are prioritizing those needs, the social and economic, this need particularly for employment creation in the long run, rather than just exports, just raising productivity in established businesses. And that in turn requires some reallocation of capacity within the DTIC and changes in existing systems to support small business, but also to support the intermediaries that we need to help support small business. And finally, I would argue a critical issue is we need to say, how do we, structural change by definition is risky and disruptive. How do we manage those risks? What are the risk management systems that would enable us to put in resources on the scale we need to bring about structural change, rather than just avoiding those risks, which has tended to be what we do to date? Sorry, Chair, I think I went over on time, but I did talk as fast as I could. Ta.
Thank you very much, Neva. I think it's a useful framing of the conference and thinking about some key issues and touches on some of the big changes that we need to think about if we want to see the kind of growth for small businesses that are needed. Let me now call over our last speaker for the opening panel, and that's Vignesh Subramani from Absa. Thanks.
Program Director, Dr. Saul Levin. Senior Economist at TIPS, Dr. Neva Makgetla. Acting DG at the DTIC, Ms. Malebo Mabitje-Thompson. South African Research Chair, Industrial Development and Professor of Economics at UJ, Professor Fiona Tregenna. Distinguished guests, my fellow colleagues from Absa, and fellow participants, good morning to you all. On behalf of Absa and on behalf of our Managing Executive, Ronnie Mbatsane, I would like to thank you for joining us at this significant milestone in our collective journey towards advancing entrepreneurship in South Africa. Today, we gather to delve into a critical topic, namely small business, inclusive growth, and industrial policy in South Africa. Let's explore the outlines of this theme and its implications for our nation's economic landscape. In 2024, the TIPS Forum is dedicated to deepening our understanding of this vital sector, its evolution, the opportunities and challenges, as well as the implications for our industrial policy. A thriving and sustainable small business sector is not just an economic concern. It is at the heart of an inclusive industrial policy in our country. Our small businesses sector faces numerous daunting challenges. It is a well-known fact, you would have seen Neva talk about it just now, that there are far fewer people in South Africa earning livelihoods from their own businesses compared to other upper middle class or middle income countries. This reality is a significant contributor to South Africa's high unemployment rate, as well as the deep inequalities in income and ownership. As we envision an inclusive industrial policy, we must recognize that the future of our economy hinges on the success of small business. Our industrial policy aimed at inclusive industrialization must therefore seek a step change, very much aligned to what Neva had mentioned just now, in the number of small businesses. We must strive to create an environment where entrepreneurship can thrive and small businesses can flourish. This forum will provide a platform to discuss the systemic obstacles that hinder the growth of small businesses in our country. It'll explore strategies for scaling up support and strengthening small business development as part of our journey towards inclusive industrialization. In doing so, the forum will encourage a discussion that considers both the challenges and opportunities of the small business sector and inclusive industrialization. We must remember that every challenge presents an opportunity and every obstacle is a step towards success. SMEs form the backbone of our economy, driving innovation, creating jobs, and fostering economic resilience. And there's really just something about South African SMEs. We are much more resilient just by our nature. As Absa, we recognize this reality and have positioned ourselves as a key partner in the SME ecosystem. Absa's involvement in this important forum is based on our vision to be a purpose-led organization. Our purpose, which is empowering Africa's tomorrow together, one story at a time. This vision highlights our commitment to be an active force for good in everything that we do and the communities that we serve. By supporting SMEs, we're not only helping build economic resilience, but we're also nurturing the entrepreneurial spirit that drives innovation and inclusive growth across the continent, not just in South Africa, but across the African continent as well. Absa provides tailored financial solutions to SMEs, addressing their unique needs. These solutions include working capital loans, trade finance, and asset financing. But we're also becoming very deliberate in terms of the sectors or underserved customer segments that we need to consider. And in October last year, we had launched very tailor-made solutions for youth and women in business, namely emerging entrepreneurs, as well as She Thrives under the Absa stable. Our commitment extends beyond traditional lending. We actively educate entrepreneurs on financial literacy, thus helping them to make informed decisions and manage their finances more effectively. In an increasingly digital world, Absa champions technological innovation. We offer digital banking platforms that simplify transactions, enhance efficiency, and improve cash flow management for SMEs. Absa is also the largest acquirer of payments processing in the African continent. Through mobile banking apps, online payment gateways, and e-commerce solutions, Absa empowers SMEs to thrive in the digital age. We were also recently named by a very prestigious award category, Euromoney, as South Africa's best bank for SMEs in 2024. And we're really proud of that. And that's why we believe we are the bank for SMEs. It is through events like the TIPS Forum that Absa actively facilitates networking opportunities for SMEs where entrepreneurs can connect, learn, and collaborate. And I encourage all of you to do that over the next couple of days. By fostering a sense of community, Absa encourages knowledge sharing and cross-pollination of ideas. Our commitment is also reflected in our substantial investment in this space. In 2023 alone, we allocated approximately 4.2 billion rand to support SMMEs, tailoring our efforts to the unique needs of each enterprise to ensure that they not only survive, but also thrive. Over the next 2 days, let's dissect the systemic barriers hindering small business growth. These hurdles, whether they are financial, regulatory, or structural, must be overcome. Our mission should be to catalyze a step change in the number of thriving small businesses by scaling up support, fostering innovation, and strengthening small business development. Inclusivity lies at the heart of our industrial policy, and small businesses are at its cornerstone. And I think the acting DG mentioned that when she spoke about including rural areas as well as peri-urban areas to ensure that we drive inclusivity across the board and to ensure that nobody gets left behind. In conclusion, Absa stands as a beacon of support for SMEs. Our multifaceted approach, including financial solutions, digital empowerment, capacity building, collaboration, and responsible citizenship, creates an ecosystem where SMEs can flourish. As we move forward, let us, as partners, rededicate ourselves to deepening the transformative impact and role that SMEs play in the South African economy. Let us come together at this forum in unity, not just as policymakers, entrepreneurs, or academics, but as South Africans committed to building a prosperous future for us all. Let us work together to ensure that small business sector, the backbone of our economy, is given the support it needs to thrive. Thank you for being part of this vital conversation. Let's propel South Africa's small business towards a brighter future. Thank you.
Thank you. We almost at the end of our opening session, just a few housekeeping things that I need to announce. The first and most important one is that we're not just presenting research here, we're presenting research that has policy implications. So I expect you to engage robustly and talk, share your own experiences, challenge speakers if you want to, and have lots of conversations outside. That's the second important announcement on the housekeeping is the networking sessions outside are as important as the discussions in the room. So we've left time for you to engage during coffee, during lunch. Please have the conversations. It's also nice to see old friends that come back every year. So it's an opportunity to engage with colleagues. So that's my second housekeeping rule. Third housekeeping is that we do have people online, so we will try to incorporate them into the discussion, and we'll see more of that, obviously not the opening session, but as we do our breakaways. My next one is there's 2 parallel sessions. You'll see from the program, QR code, scan if you want to get the program, or there are a couple of trees that we chopped down and turned into pamphlets that you can pick up. But we're having one session here, which is Jacaranda 1. And then Jacaranda 3 is across the courtyard. So we will be running the parallel sessions, and we hopefully will get back on time. We did start a few minutes late and we are a few minutes over, but we will try and stick on to time. Then there is Wi-Fi. I think it's Forum 2024. There's what's it, an ex-Twitter thing. Hashtag Tips Forum 2024 for those that do that kind of thing. And the papers and presentations will be available on the TIPS website. We've got a TIPS Forum website, which is accessible through the tips.org.za. Not all, but most of the papers. Some people still want to submit their papers to journals, so they won't be publishing it on the TIPS website. But most of the presentations and papers and the videos from today will be available on our website. Thanks, everyone. Let's break to the next session. Thanks.